Thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm going to be talking about some of the finds from our 15,000-year-old site of Les Varines on Jersey. This is part of a broader project with colleagues from a variety of different institutions looking at the Paleolithic and Mesolithic of Jersey. And we're drawn to looking at Jersey. It's a microcosm of sort of broader process going on elsewhere. We have Jersey very much being affected by process such as environmental change, and particularly sea level, with it transforming from uplands in the Channel or Manche River Valley to a peninsula of northern France, and finally an island. So 15,000 years ago, Jersey was high land in the Channel River Valley, and sea levels may have been as much as 100 meters lower than today. The evidence suggests we're dealing with a cold climate, cold adapted fauna such as mammoth, reindeer, and an open vegetation, grasslands, perhaps sort of scrubby dwarf birch and willow and things like that. We're dealing with pioneer Upper Paleolithic groups known as Magdalenian, who are moving back into Northern Europe after the height of the last ice age, when they were broadly restricted to warmer areas of Europe along the Mediterranean, and particularly southern France and northern Spain. And we see people moving back just before a period of warming we get about 14,700 years ago. So the site of Les Varines is to the east of St Helier. On this map, you can see it's near the head of a small dry valley in a relatively sheltered location. The site consists of two fields, an upper field shown at the top and a lower field at the bottom. And stone tools were first found as a plough zone scatter in the lower field. And we became interested in this area in 2010, trying to find out where the stone tools came from. And we spent a few years doing small scale excavations in the area of the lower field. But it became apparent that the material here was not in primary contexts. So the section on the right, you can just about see little layers of interdigitating granitic sands and much finer sediment, windblown sediment called loess, which have washed down from higher up in a cold period when things aren't so vegetated, when sediments are much less stable. And here, this shows also OSL dates from the sequence, giving us a bit of a sense of when these changes occurred. My colleagues Martin and Richard Bates undertook a lot of geophysical survey to really understand the changing topography of this area. And they discovered through coring and geophysics that in the past the area was a little coal between two bits of hard granite, and that fine-grained sediment shown here as blue where the finds were deriving from. So we moved into the upper field, chasing the in situ archaeology. At first, we got similar material that was washing downslope in little rills. But by the end of 2015, we began to find material that seemed much more in situ. So substantial stones that were less likely to move, areas of charcoal here. And the lithic showed much more random pattern of orientation rather than the focusing on the direction of slope flow as they had in lower areas. So we opened up larger areas, and here we see substantial granitic paving, and we became aware that this was quite a complex and interesting site with lots of features and lots of occupation evidence. And it very much sort of bore similarities to some of the classic sites of this date across Northern Europe, such as the site of Gonnersdorf in Germany, Etiole and Verberie in France. So large numbers of pits, hearths, um, areas of ochre, things like that. So on the western side of the site, we found an area of intercutting features. So one pit that's got flint and burnt material cut by a pit here, which you can just about see a red splodge, which seems to be filled in some way with ochre. Just next to this, we have another area of hearth. Again, with lots of lithic material associated, some of which seems to have washed in. And there's very little charcoal associated with this hearth, probably because it's a treeless landscape. People instead seem to be burning bone. There's huge quantities of burnt bone associated with this hearth, and what seems to be a refuse dump of animal bone and stone next to it. On the eastern side of the site, we find a series of hearths at a number of different levels, suggesting people returned to this site over a period of time. Again, use of animal bone for fuel, and also a pit or hearth with a number of imported stones in it as well. So very carefully sort of structured evidence bearing similarities to the sort of archaeology we see on much larger sites of this date in Northern Europe. Also granite slabs, again, Bonnersdorf, so quite typical of this sort of archaeology. Very large numbers of artifacts, over 8,000 pieces of flint. There's no local flint on Jersey, so this is all imported. Some seems to come from a river cobble source, presumably on the now drowned Manche Valley. There's also a chalk source, maybe from Normandy, or we know there are sort of sources south of Alderney. Very much a focus on the manufacture of little back bladelets, which seem to be armatures for spears and darts. There's debates about whether bow and arrow technology was invented at this time, and also a lot of burins, they're traditionally seen as tools for bone and antler working. A few scrapers, but they're relatively rare. Also a number of enigmatic round stone objects which have been sort of knapped like flint into a circular shape, which seem without parallel for sites of this date. But perhaps most exciting of all are a series of flat engraved stones. We've discovered these over a number of years. With refits, we have 8 engraved pieces, 5 which show more extensive areas of engraving. Here are 2 of the earliest pieces we found, and work by Sylvia Bello and Simon Parfit show these actually fit back together because the site was very cold and occupied afterwards. A lot of these seem to perhaps have been broken through freeze-thaw action. There have been arguments that these soft stones called plaquettes were intentionally broken after being used. And here's this piece with another small piece also refitted. This is still fragmentary, but it shows a much larger focus of the engraving. My colleague Sylvia Bello at the Natural History Museum has used a high-powered microscope to really trace the order of the engraving, which is really important on making sense of these plaquettes, where there's really a tradition of overwriting of designs superimposed on designs. She's found a broad pattern amongst these objects at Les Varines, in that we have a a sort of series, a series of sub-parallel lines engraved first, followed by a second series of more curved and sometimes more representational elements. So on this example here, a broader stone tool was used for the second phase, though this could also be a single stone tool getting blunter. This is the most complete and extensively engraved piece we discovered in 2018. It's got a chip missing, but it's broadly otherwise complete. It's a flat circular stone with a series of engravings superimposed upon it. And again, Sylvia's picks these apart. And here we have a much more complex sequence. So two series of sub-parallel lines. Again, these always come first. Then the orange lines very much sort of frame the borders of this object. And then finally, the sort of reddy brown lines, which again, perhaps have slightly more representational elements among them. And Sylvia's tried to sort of pull these elements out. So here we see some potential schematic engravings. So at the top we have a bovid, perhaps an aurochs or a bison. On the bottom left we have a mammoth's back, trunk and tusk. And there are a few of these slightly schematic potential mammoths on the stone. And even more schematic than the others, a human face. It's on its side, so an eye there, another eye, a nose, top of the head. This we see quite interesting patterns in the Magdalenian, in that while animals are represented with great accuracy, humans tend not to be. They tend to be really odd looking. It's been suggested perhaps there's taboos on the accurate representation of a human face. Perhaps if drawing was seen to have a power, to hold a power over someone, which there are hints that might be elements of these art. Here's another much more fragmentary, but again fitting the pattern of this sequence. So we have two series of sub-parallel lines, the blue and the green, and then the more curved lines, in this case orange, a slightly more representational element. And these potentially seem to be the sort of rumps and tails of horses. You can see here perhaps a herd of horses, but we see in Magdalenian art sort of cartoon-like sort of images of movement. So this may be sort of a cartoon sequence almost of a horse moving. And this image, this overwriting that we see in all the plaquettes is actually very common across Europe. Perhaps the idea that the art only has meaning. At the moment, it's engraved, and after that, it loses its power and it can be engraved again. So let's look more broadly at how our evidence fits into the sort of broader Upper Paleolithic or Magdalenian world. So the late Varine plaquettes are covered with abstract signs, mostly sub-parallel lines with possible representational elements. And this is pretty much par for the course. Lines are the main theme of these types of objects, which are found across Europe, quite often in very large numbers. Over 500 are found at the German site of Gonnersdorf, for example. And if we look at local examples, Roque-la-Tour, the closest site with large numbers of these plaquettes, these flat stones, we see abstract elements outnumbering representational elements to 8 to 1. So what we have at Leverine is pretty typical. Subparallel lines are the most common form of engraving of these sort of flat, soft stones. And here we can see an example from Gonnersdorf, which really shows, which is very much typical of this sort of art. So very similar to what we see on Leverine plaquettes. We see subparallel lines, we see curved lines, some of which are abstract, but here we see part of an animal sort of peeking out to us, a sort of horse with a mane, perhaps a few more elements of animals here. So these animals are hidden, and this sort of overwriting is very sort of typical of this art. We can think a bit more, because of excavations for Leverine, about the sort of manufacturing sequence and the context. We're very lucky that we have these, which we don't always have at some of these sites. So in terms of raw material, what was used was a plitic microgranite. This is a very, very fine microgranite. In fact, the stones themselves look very much like schist. They're sort of very soft, with a greenish tinge. Microgranite can be found in Jersey today, in the southwest, but it's a known component of the granite at the site of Leverine. So just here, we can't find it today, but the topography was very different 15,000 years ago, and it may well be that it's a local stone. The sort of qualities of this stone very much fit into what we see elsewhere. A range of soft, flat stones were selected for plaquette manufacture. I mean, these are sort of the ideal. The flat, the softness helps for ease of engraving. They tend to be sort of schist or shale, and though people at Leverine are choosing microgranite, it actually has a very similar set of properties. And people use predominantly local stone, so it's Gonnersdorf, a couple of 100 meters away, similar at Roque-Latour and at Laine, even the south of France, again, very local material. If we look at the production execution of designs, because the site has had taphonomic issues, we can't tell from the microware whether the surface was prepared through polishing and grinding. Looking at some of the unmodified plaquettes, I suspect they were, and we can't tell exactly what tool was used for engraving. But experimental work done in the context of the site of Gunnersdorf suggests that burins, which are specialized engraving tools, broken blades and flakes are all very effective, done very quickly, with relatively little practice needed. And what's very interesting is these experiments showed that the engraving produces a powder that makes the engravings momentarily visible. So even amongst these overwritten plaquettes, drawing something would make it visible, but only briefly, and then it would fade, and the lines would be invisible amongst the remainder of the engravings. So this may suggest these reputations were some way secret, only known to a number of people who saw the engraving, or perhaps that they only had meaning in the actual act of engraving. It was doing the act, the brief visibility of it, and then the fading of it that was important. We can also look at the context in which these are found. First of all, they're all pretty much broken, and there have been arguments more broadly about whether these things were intentionally destroyed. We can't tell whether these are just these seem more taphonomic issues at Leverine, but we can't tell for definite. But certainly some of the German ones seem to have been intentionally broken and images disguised. If we look at where our plaquettes are found, our engraved plaquettes are the sort of red stars and the green circles. They're found around hearths, which are our red blobs, and also around pits as well, which are the blue circles, including next to a pit with ochre. And this is again very typical of what we see in the continent: finds of pits, finds at Gonnersdorf in a hut structure which has an ochre floor. And in Gonnersdorf, they get reuse of elements of pavement. And we see quite a concentration here which was amongst an area of granite paving of two plaquettes, but these three here seem to have washed down slope from this area. So very interesting context of deposition, perhaps being reused as parts of hearths, deposited in pits and made into paving. Again, suggesting sort of domestic context, but also that these had fleeting meanings. So I'd just like to finish by drawing some of this evidence together and thinking about how the art of Les Varines and the settlement evidence fits into this broader world of Magdalenian pioneer colonizers into Northwest Europe. So the plaquettes very much fit into this sort of broader pattern of objects found across Western Europe, use of soft, probably local stone, focus on abstract designs. This again is the art of the moment. These engravings were briefly visible before they were overwritten, with the plaquettes reused and destroyed. So as I said before, this art may only have had meaning or significance for a brief period, and perhaps with secret relating to just to the people who could see the engraving of it. We also see a quite interesting contrast to the other broad category of Magdalenian representation, that is cave art. So Clot, the French archaeologist, points out that a lot of the more spectacular elements of cave art are what he calls sanctuaries. He suggests they're very much set apart from living sites. So the sites in the Pyrenees, he suggests, are maybe a day's walk from the nearest settlement site. Again, we see this at Cresswell Crags, where the cave art site Churchill seems to have much less occupation evidence and is on the north side facing side of the crags, compared to the sort of much more domestic sites of the south side. But this is a real contrast to plaquette, the engraved plaquettes, which are very much found in a domestic context, amongst the refuse of everyday life. It's important to remember that these are pioneer groups in a new area. So it may be important that what they're producing is much more domestic art, something that might have power, but temporary power, but then it's used amongst the debris of living sites. This may be a way that people are creating a cultural landscape, making relationships with new landscapes and new places. The structural evidence at Les Varines very much fits into the evidence of the pioneer colonizers of Northern Europe. The sites we get in in Germany and Northern France. We have very similar sets of evidence in pits, structures, hearths, and also in the types of projectile points used. What is interesting is we do see a difference in projectile points compared to these sites, comparing these sites to what we see in Britain. And we need to bear in mind that Les Varines is on the south of the Channel River valley, and it may be that the Channel River formed a major cultural and geographic barrier, and that this was really the sort of furthest north that these particular groups ventured, and then we see perhaps a slightly later colonization of Britain from the east. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and I hope you've found discussion of the context of these really unique engraved objects interesting.